Hi, we continue today in Genesis 44 as Joseph has sent his servant with instructions to both put his silver cup in the bag of the youngest, Benjamin, and then to confront them as thieves. And they'll be returning to Egypt with a confusion in their minds about what exactly is going on. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following the chiasm that starts at the beginning of chapter 43 here, and now is at the very center, the D part, the brothers in custody. And I put that for parallelism with the chiasm in chapter 42 that you can see on the inner bracket there where they are in custody. They're not formally in custody here, but they're certainly under the control of Joseph and Joseph's agent and be returning to Egypt under his control. And then we'll see how it continues with the second audience, and that will really highlight Judah's speech to Joseph, the longest speech in all of Genesis, the departure from Egypt and the return again to Jacob. So I won't go over again today some of the things you can see in this themes and structure chart, which we've been going over throughout this unit, and we'll get back at more of those things as we go. Looking at the shape of our story, we've been noting how chapter 44, in contrast to chapter 43, where Joseph is referred to overall by both the narrator and by the brothers as the man, and the brothers referred to as the men. Now in this chapter, we can see, especially in the scene we're going to be on today, the language is Lord and slave. So I've highlighted all the my lords, my lord, my lord, my lord throughout. I'll note that we'll look at it today. There's one that I didn't highlight, your lord, that interrupts all the my lords because they're speaking now to Joseph's servant rather than to Joseph directly. But that's an interesting element we'll look at there. So this is on the language of hierarchy, not yet the language of family between them, which it'll get to eventually. But one of the most interesting things about this scene are the parallels between this scene and the scene of Laban chasing down Jacob and Laban's two daughters, Rachel and Leah, back in chapter 30 and 31, as you can see on the right side of the screen. So the color-coded elements are parts that are common to both our current scene on the left column here and the Laban chase in the right column. And not only that, if you haven't watched the previous video where I noted this, of all these different words that are in these two places, only a couple of them are anywhere else in Genesis than only these scenes. So plainly we're supposed to see these two scenes as parallel. And they're parallel not just in the language, but in these various character correlations. And that's something I'd like to focus on today as we enter into this, because we'll see that although there are many parallels, one of the interesting elements is in Genesis 31, it was Rachel who was hiding the object of divination, her father's teraphim, which are sometimes translated in the NRSV as gods, but as objects of divination. Here it's Joseph who takes his own silver cup and puts it in the sack of his youngest brother Benjamin. So the dynamics are different there in many ways. Rachel takes the object and keeps it herself under her own saddle, whereas Joseph has his servant put the silver goblet in Benjamin's sack. So there are many parallels, but there are also differences. And one thing I'd like to suggest here is that Joseph is following in his mother's footsteps there. How else would Joseph know about this pattern, assuming he does know, assuming it's not just something the writer and the narrator are doing, other than Rachel told him? And we don't know that. The text never says. The text shows no relationship between Rachel and her son Joseph at all, in great contrast to the previous generation, where Rebekah clearly teaches Jacob how to either trick Isaac in getting the blessing back in Genesis 27, or to be prepared to trick her brother Laban when they send Jacob back to the old country, both in the negative sense, avoiding Esau's murderous hate of his brother, but also anticipating Laban's slipperiness of the old country. And so as we saw there, that Rebekah preparing Jacob for it, Jacob was hesitant. He was certain that his father would recognize that his hands are not Esau's hairy hands, his voice is not his brother's voice, and the food he prepared from the goats was not the wild game that his father preferred from the hand of Esau the hunter. But he ends up doing it, even though he still falls under Laban's trap and ends up having to spend 20 years there, even though he thought he was going to get Rachel for 7. So part of the issue there was preparing Jacob to deal with people in power positions, which is also, I'd suggest, an element of dealing with the Israelites and Judahites in Babylonian exile. Laban clearly represents the Babylonians there in the old country. And so the issue is, what's our relationship with the Babylonians in exile, and what do we have to do to get out of exile? But the dynamics in our immediate situation are very different. Joseph is not the oppressed person, he's the oppressor person. So what we're seeing is the strategy here, or the way of women, which was exemplified and expressed explicitly by Rachel when her father Laban asked her to get off the camel, and she says, I can't do it. The way of women is upon me. A wordplay which suggests to most readers, and apparently to her father, that she's in the middle of having her period. But I interpret it there as part of what Israel's strategy is in a world amidst empires, to take the passive, deceptive role as opposed to the extroverted, violent role of men. In other words, Jacob is a man of the tents, more like his mother than like his father, where Esau becomes like his father, the hunter. And that's the issue there, that in order to defeat empire, if you take them on head on, you're likely to get crushed. But if you take them on with a sort of Eastern sense, if you will, in the same way that Eastern martial arts tend to use the strength of the opponent against them, here you can use their assumptions against them, as we also see in texts like Exodus, where the midwives use that same strategy to defeat Pharaoh's desire to kill all the baby boys of the Israelites. So the tactic is the same, but the power dynamics are very different. And I'd like to suggest that saying something to the Joseph audience, the Joseph story audience here, the Genesis audience, if you will, about what the consequences are of being like the brothers, of not questioning what's going on and getting sucked right into the Moab Empire and becoming slaves there, as they do when the book is over and it transitions to the Exodus story. So that's some of the context in which we want to look at the individual scenes, elements of our scene today. So if we go back to our shape of our scene here, and let's just jump right in verse 7. So we saw last time, when he overtook them, he worded these words to them. And that was hiding last time, and we see it again today, that using the verb and the noun in the Hebrew dabar for worded words, as opposed to what we see here, speak such words, recalls what we saw back in chapter 37 and the others, where the same verb and noun for dream was at issue, so he dreamed a dream. So there the issue was Joseph apparently having a power to understand dreams, whether that's from God or not is another issue. Now it's a question of what the power of these words are to persuade people to either let them go or to keep them there, depending upon whose perspective you are on. So they said to him, and notice they're speaking collectively here, whereas in the scene that follows, Judah will speak, and they'll be introduced as Judah and his brothers, and Judah will give, as I noted, the longest speech in the book of Genesis. But now they're speaking collectively, so it's some hint of their solidarity here, although it plays both ways, as we'll see. So they speak together as one voice. Why does my Lord speak such words? Or why does my Lord word such words as this? Far be it from your slaves, and as I've been noting throughout, the New RSV softens the language of slavery into servants, but it plainly is the language of slavery, and there's no need to soften it. If you're working for Joseph, you're a slave, and we'll see that explicitly in chapter 47, when all of Egypt will become Joseph's personal slaves. So far be it from your servants, they should do such a thing. This goes, of course, back to their claim right in the beginning that they were honest, that he was charging them then with being spies and seeking to see the nakedness of the land, a charge that got dropped later. But there they claim to be honest, and certainly implicitly they're saying the same thing here. And here's their explanation in verse 8. Look, or behold, the shorter form of Hannah, which behold really is like look, so there's no problem there. The money or the silver that we found at the mouth of our sacks, as these things always are, we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. Highlighting, of course, that although they could have stayed in the land of Canaan and left the money there, and how would he have known, they brought it all the way back, highlighting their strong desire to return it. It's as if someone got extra change at the store, back in the days when you got change at the store, and went back to the grocery store to give them the money. How many people would actually do that? So that's what they're claiming. We're not only honest, we went the extra many miles. Why then would we steal silver or gold? Highlighting that the more valuable item, gold, would be the more likely one to be stolen, but they didn't steal either. But here's the interesting shift in perspective. From your Lord's house. And we're reminded here, they're speaking to the servant of Joseph, the one over his house, as we saw, the one Joseph sent out with this message. So they're speaking to him, they're not speaking to Joseph. But otherwise, they alternate and mostly speak him as if he's the Lord. So they, in verse 7, as we saw, why does my Lord speak? That's certainly the case that Joseph's servant is lording it over them as the representative of the vizier of Egypt. But he's not the one they're ultimately concerned with. It's obviously Joseph. So now they speak that way, your Lord's house, that Joseph is their Lord, the slave's Lord, as much as he is, in the speech at least, their Lord. Although, is he their Lord? We would think that their Lord would be Yahweh or Elohim or something, but they don't seem to have any relationship with God throughout this whole story, other than to perhaps wrongly infer God's presence in some of the circumstances that happen. So they continue with this very rash statement, exactly parallel, of course, to what Jacob said back here. Anyone with whom you'll find your God shall not live. Should it be found with any of your slaves, let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. Why would they want to take that kind of risk? It's certainly not necessary to do that, given, as the note suggests here from Turner down below, given the previous mysterious reappearance of the silver in their sacks, might they not hesitate before being so rash? As Wenham notes, while we're on that note, punishment of theft with slavery or death has echoes of their treatment of Joseph. The brothers are now offering to suffer as they made him suffer. Although they don't know that exactly, they sent him off to be sold, but they didn't know that he was going to die, and in fact, of course, he hasn't died. But why would they want to make this offer other than to suggest it's their most extreme statement of their belief in their own honesty, given the several circumstances that have happened? Not to mention, I am going to mention, but they don't, that in the meal scene that preceded their departure the next morning at sunlight, Benjamin was given 5 times as much food as the rest of them, and yet they were stunned by that but didn't question it. So there are many situations here, many clues that would lead them to understand more of what's going on than they seem to do, and not to make this kind of risky statement, but they don't. So having said that, they say, moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. And here, finally, it is that. But in Hebrew, they already are, given the consistent use of Evan, and that's my note there. So it's not a matter of moving from servants to slaves, is that any one of your slaves, we will become my Lord's slaves, clearly meaning Joseph's slaves, but Joseph's not there. So he said, which is still the servant of the house, the slave of the house, even so, gamata, also so, and we see several examples of that same form, in accordance with your word. And as we see here, highlighting that, your word, when he overtook them, he worded these words. They questioned that, but now it's in accordance with their words, not with his words. So their words become what happens here. The one with whom it is found shall become my slave, but the rest of you shall go free. But as we see, that's not in accordance with their words. He reverses the equation. They were suggesting one dies and the rest become slaves, and they're saying one becomes slaves and the rest go free. That nobody is going to die in this circumstance. So the servant of Joseph is more lenient than they are in this understanding. The term for going free is only one other time in Genesis, and it's a very telling one in 24:41. Let's go back and look at that, because it involves the first trip to the old country where Abraham's servant went to get eventually Rebekah. So he says to them, quoting what Abraham said to him, although not exactly as we looked at there. So this is Abraham being quoted through Abraham's servant speaking to Laban. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my kindred. Even if they will not give her to you, you'll be free from my oath. Highlighting there that if he simply made the trip, he would be free from the oath, even if he didn't manage to bring Rebekah back. So it's a conditional moment saying to Laban that if I got here, I'm free from my oath. Here, the condition of being free, not from an oath, but from the servant statement, is where the goblet is to be found. Notice he doesn't suggest any possibility the goblet won't be found at all. It's just a question of with whom it's found. And of course, he knows that for sure because he put it there. And so the charade of beginning with the eldest is just a charade. He obviously knows exactly where it is. Then we see another interesting echo. Then each one lowered his sack to the ground, and that's not an echo with the Laban story. I don't have it there. It's an echo here. It's an echo with a second echo with the Abraham servant and Rebekah story, which we see here as she says to him, "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. So there, the quickly lowering suggested to Abraham's servant that she was the right kind of woman, that she's hard at work and she has hospitality instincts and practices, and we see that there. Here, each one lowering a sack is presumably to show their innocence, which they certainly believe they are, and they are all innocent of this crime at least. They didn't take the cup, but they're going to be found, one of them with the cup in the end. And notice each one now. So we've seen their solidarity before, but now each one lowering their sack and each one opening it separately. So the solidarity they had in speaking is being torn apart now by the possibility that one of them will become a slave and the others will be released. Notice they didn't object to that idea that we would all be in it one way or another. So he searched, again echoing from chapter 31, as you can also see in the light blue on the right side, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, which also echoes Rachel and Leah way back here. Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the eldest was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel, using the exact same language. Notice here, the eldest isn't named because he's irrelevant to the story. Can you remember which one Leah's firstborn was? Because the speaker will be Judah, who's the 4th born, but the first 3 have disqualified themselves because of previous behavior. But still, to follow the tradition, the beginning one is searched, and then finally with the youngest. And going through all these sacks would take quite a bit of time, one imagine, especially filled with grain. Did they take all the grain out and pour it on the ground, or did they just look in the mouth of the sack? It's not clear, given how many bags there are. I'd estimated it could be as much as 10 tons if it's a year's worth for 50 people. Maybe it's not that much, but this is an exercise in anxiety and suspense that only covers a verse here, but would take quite a while. And to nobody's surprise except the brothers, the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Benjamin doesn't react here, and he doesn't react to anything except, as we'll see, the final reunion once he discovers that the vizier of Egypt is his bigger brother Joseph. At this, they tore their clothes. And that isn't a recollection of the Laban story, but it's a recollection of the beginning where Jacob, we can see back here in 37-34, Jacob tore his garments and mourned for his son, who he at that point believes is dead because of the deception of the brothers. So now, the deception of Joseph via his servant has led them to do the same thing, to tear their clothes and either believe, wrongly and strangely, of course, that Benjamin was in fact a thief and stole Joseph's silver goblet. That's unimaginable. Or that somehow, through somebody's agency, they're being set up. And then we see them back to their individuality here and no longer in solidarity. Each one loaded his donkey and returned to the unknown city that frames this story now. And now they're back in Joseph's custody, and we'll have to see what happens when they confront him again to try to get out of Egypt one more time. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.